Good morning. I am Down Sowers, and I'm happy to welcome you all this Friday morning to this panel focusing on the resilience of the European Union. Political and economic shocks have occurred regularly throughout the 70 years of modern European integration. From the Korean War breaking out just weeks before the Schuman Declaration in 1950, the empty chair crisis of the 1960s, stagflation in the 1970s, and the collapse of communism in the late 80s and early 90s, followed by civil war and conflict in Yugoslavia. Europe has regularly been stricken by internal and external events. Some scholars argue that while these crises may well have posed short-term risks to European unity, they've actually been critical in driving forward European integration. Indeed, one of the fathers of the European community, Jean Monnet, is said to have seen every crisis as an opportunity. Well, if that is the case, then we should expect an acceleration of European integration initiatives over the next few years. After all, the last 10 years have seen the EU confront an unprecedented series of shocks and challenges. The decade began with the EU recovering from the most severe financial crisis since the 1930s, continued with a migration and refugee crisis, and ended with a pandemic. At the same time, the EU's global share of GDP has continued to decline. Climate change meant that this decade was the hottest on record, and Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit and other democracy indexes have recorded a steady fall in the quality of democracy across the European region, and some member states even seem to be flirting with authoritarianism. And I haven't even mentioned Brexit. How has the EU responded to these challenges? After all, Winston Churchill, speaking in the British Parliament's House of Commons almost 100 years ago, said that to improve is to change. So to be perfect is to have changed often. And the great Latvian writer and statesman Jānis Rainis famously wrote that what changes endures. So, to help us make sense of these events that have marked the last decade and reflect on the adaptability and the resilience of the European Union, we have a distinguished panel of experts from the worlds of politics, journalism, and academia. Here in the studio with me is Dr. Vaida Vīķe-Freiberga, who is still the last president to have been elected for 2 terms in Latvia and served the country during the early years of this century, the critical early years when Latvia successfully joined the European Union and NATO and integrated fully with Western Europe. Elsewhere, sitting by their screens all across Europe, we have, first of all, Valdis Dombrovskis, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, who has a, frankly, dizzying list of responsibilities under the An Economy That Works for the People title, including, most recently, the trade portfolio. Ana Palacio, who has served in the Spanish Parliament, the European Parliament, has been Spain's foreign minister, and is a member of Spain's Council of State. David Herzenhorn, Politico's chief Brussels correspondent, and who, in an earlier life, working for the New York Times, served as both the Washington, D.C. bureau chief and in Moscow. And Dr. Jana Puglerin, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So, Madam President, I turn to you first. You have been a participant and an observer of European politics for several decades now. How does the COVID-19 pandemic that we have experienced over the last year or so compare to the financial and security crises Europe has faced at various stages over the previous 20 years? How do you think the European Union looks? Has it become more resilient, or has the pandemic revealed continuing vulnerabilities in the integration project?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to answer these questions. Many people across Europe and elsewhere are asking themselves about it. And I think it's important to emphasize right from the start that the European Union is based on an idea of solidarity and cooperation instead of armed conflict or conflicts of another sort. Differences of opinion, of course, are part of such a process. The integration has been very gradual. It has taken a very long time. It has been at times difficult, but it's work in progress, so that the resiliency of the European Union is always proven and manifested by how the Union is able to react to the unpredictable and to the unpredicted. Over the decades, areas of collaboration have been established where countries share a bit of their national sovereignty, sort of pool it together in a common pot and submit themselves to a coordinated central authority. But the budget of any country is its own responsibility. How it runs its own finances has always been its own responsibility. Europe is based on a sharing of contributions, a distribution of contributions, but the national budget of each country remains a sovereign responsibility. When the banking crisis of 2008 arose, it was a crisis that started across the ocean. It was a crisis of the financial markets, of the business culture that had developed in banks and investment agencies and operators. Completely distorted and unhealthy climate and business ethic had developed within investors and bankers. And everybody had to suffer the consequences, Europe included. And that was a stimulus, a basis for taking steps about coordinating banking efforts, coordinating the Eurozone collaboration much more intensively than before, and having better surveillance of money and resource flows within banking and financial institutions. It was a crisis of capitalism. It was not a crisis of Europe. But Europe had to react to this financial crisis of capitalism, with what instruments it had at hand. And it had not been created for doing that, but it did its best, and I think it overcame it in the end, as we know. COVID is something that we knew was coming. A pandemic was to be expected. In the fall of 2019, I was addressing a conference that the French Senate had organized in commemoration of the fall of the Wall of Berlin. And I said on that occasion that what Europe needs is a coordinated crisis center which would be operative in terms of security threats of various kinds. And we just heard from Madam von der Leyen that security is a common good. Well, health is a common good. Education is a common good. We need a coordinating crisis center Europe-wide where information comes in, and nowadays with the technology that is available, it's absolutely easy, relatively easy to do. Information flows in. We have had a natural experiment going on about the spread of a pandemic and attempts to contain it and various results that it gives. It is a natural experiment run by nature on over 400 million people. I do hope that existing centers of research, scientists, ministries are keeping very careful records that this natural experiment and the fatalities linked to it will not be in vain, so that the data can be used to study, analyze, and take steps for the future as to how to respond in a crisis situation. This time we needed masks of the ordinary kind that people wear for protection. But if it had been a chemical attack or terrorist attack, we would have needed gas masks. Well, how many gas masks does every country keep in reserve? Would it not be wasteful to have millions of gas masks available for a theoretically possible threat of that nature? Instead, what we need is to have plans for supply chains not being interrupted, for sharing of resources in the maximum speed possible. And I think in a way, Europe is building this up gradually as we go. In my understanding, it should be more formal, it should be officially established, and it should be something that is a permanent structure.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll be returning to these crisis management issues later on in the discussion. But now let's zoom across to the center of Europe, to Brussels, to Mr. Dombrovskis. And I presume you are in Brussels. Now, Mr. Dombrovskis, you've been at the very heart of the European Commission's response to the unique challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you tell us about the Recovery and Resilience Facility and other measures the EU has adopted? And most importantly, are these measures sufficient? Over to you.
Jā, labrīt, Latvija, godātā Līdz kundze, godātie klātesošie. So, good morning to everyone. Indeed, if we are to discuss EU crisis response, I would say that EU has responded to this crisis at massive scale and in a spirit of European solidarity. I can just briefly outline you a number of measures which European Union has done as a response of the crisis. One of the first measures to give necessary fiscal state aid rules flexibility to member states so that member states can use their financing to support companies, to support people in jobs. Then we allowed for maximum flexibility of use of existing EU financing still within this multi-annual financial framework, which ends this year. So allowing member states to use it also as a crisis response and providing 100% EU financing, so no national co-financing. We agreed a package of crisis response measures, 540 billion euros, which includes SURE to support employment, to support short-term work schemes, which includes European Investment Bank's Pan-European Guarantee Fund to support European companies, including SMEs, and which includes European Stability Mechanism's pandemic crisis support to provide lending to sovereigns if necessary. So this was a major crisis package which is adopted and which is currently being implemented. In parallel, European Central Bank was doing its monetary policy action, including through pandemic's emergency purchase program. And we had seen that all those measures have helped to soften the blow of the crisis, notably on the employment, because if you look at the figures of employment, they are holding up better than one could have expected at the crisis of this depth. And then the next step was to agree the financing from the recovery, so the ambitious next multi-annual financial framework and European Economic Recovery Plan, Next Generation EU. So those two combined gives us as a financing firepower of 1.82 trillion euros over the next 7 years. So this is a massive amount of money. Say in case of Latvia, it also means available financing in form of grants of around 10 billion euros. Once again, of course, it's important that it's put to the good and productive use. And what we want to achieve with this massive financial package is not only economic recovery. So our intention would not be to come back to the pre-crisis state, but we want economic recovery to be green and digital. so to stimulate also green and digital transition of our economy. Already at the introduction, Mr. Auers also mentioned climate change, which has not gone away, and we still need to continue to deal with this. And also to ensure that recovery is inclusive, addressing territorial cohesion and addressing social inequalities. So those are the main elements. Actually, just this week, co-legislators finally reached agreement on this package. So this is good news. And just today, we are starting also a trilogues legislative process on recovery and resilience facility. Actually, just after this conference panel, I will be going to European Parliament to start the first trilogue on recovery and resilience facility, which is an engine of our recovery plan. And the basic idea here is that money will be available to member states based on their recovery and resilience plans, where they need to outline coherent packages of investments and reforms in line with the challenges identified in European semester, in line with common European priorities, and also meeting the mainstreaming targets, so 37% climate mainstreaming target and 20% digital mainstreaming target. So this is the state of play of Europeans' response. The question was raised, is it enough? Of course, we need to continue to monitor the economic development, and we need to be ready to respond if necessary. But I would say at current stage, it's important that we concentrate on implementation of the agreed instruments. So we have lots of money on table. What we need now is to make sure that this money is actually starting to flow to the member states and starting to make a real difference on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dombrovskis. We now go to the south of Europe, to Ms. Palacio. The EU's Mediterranean states bore the brunt of the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in spring this year. How do you evaluate the EU's initial response to the crisis, and perhaps also the longer term, which Mr. Dombrovskis outlined here, the massive amount of money to be spent on green and digital developments in the future? Is this planned economic recovery package sufficient to ease recovery in Spain and in these other hard-hit Mediterranean countries? The floor is yours, Ms. Palacio. Ms. Palacio appears not to have joined us.
I don't see her on her screen.
Okay. Then we will skip back to Ms. Palacio and go to Mr. Herzenhorn. So, Mr. Herzenhorn, before coming to Brussels, you worked in Washington, D.C. for the New York Times, including the critical years of financial crisis and recovery between 2007 and 2011. Crisis, in a sense, seems to follow you around, which I suppose is a good thing for a journalist. How do you evaluate the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And could you compare it to the US federal response to the 2007 financial crisis and perhaps also this year's pandemic? How resilient is the European Union compared to the US federal government?
Well, good morning first, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today to be part of such a distinguished panel. And I think you've seen by the high-level participation at the Riga conference why those of us who cover Brussels and the EU very closely are saying that Latvia is the new Luxembourg, punching quite above its weight in its role here in all the EU institutions. It's unfair in a way, to jump onto your question, to compare of course, the EU to any country, given that the EU is a supranational multilateral organization. It's not a national government with a national response. And of course, it's not necessarily fair to compare any country, any one country to the United States, which we all know enjoys a special, a rather special advantage when it comes to questions of resilience. And that's, of course, called the US dollar as the world's dominant reference currency. Of course, that permits Washington what many would say is an unfair advantage sometimes when it comes to resilience. But I do think there is truth to the old maxim that the EU is never better than in a crisis, and we can talk about how it's responded this year. In Washington, during the financial crisis that followed in 2007, 2008, it fell victim not just to the financial crisis, but of course to the partisan politics that we see continuing to play out even right now. As far as I know, Donald Trump still hasn't conceded the presidential race. Where Democrats at first had formed quite a strong partnership with then President Bush, but really struggled to bring Republicans on board. And then once Barack Obama took office, it was even harder. So I covered very closely the stimulus package that was finally put together with a bare minimum of Republican support, then as now coming from the northeast corner of Maine. And what we saw there was a $787 billion. At the time, it seemed like an astronomical amount. No one had ever seen it before. And the lesson in hindsight, of course, getting to a very important question that Vice President Dombrovskis raised about the response now was, is it enough? It wasn't enough. It did the job, barely. Barack Obama today is boasting about that. But in fact, when everybody looks back, and I think the response we've seen in the US and in the EU to this current pandemic and this crisis, there are lessons that were rooted in the response to the last financial crisis. And one of those was, if you're going to go big. And the EU definitely has gone big. So let's talk a little bit about this. I also want to distinguish first, as we jump forward to the EU and to Brussels, to distinguish between the EU response, meaning the EU institutions, especially the Commission and the EU member states. What we saw at the outset of the pandemic was a lot of chaos and panic and disorganization in the capitals. It's understandable because, in a way, no one had predicted this crisis. And yet, we need to be honest about the fact that a pandemic of some sort was eminently predictable and had been predicted for quite a long time. And so there really was a deficit in preparedness there that the Commission and the EU institutions had to confront, as capitals did not have, many of them, pandemic preparedness plans ready. We wrote a very big story, I did in Politico, about how Europe failed that initial test. Europe, not the EU per se, because capitals slammed, the borders closed, they were hoarding protective equipment. When the Commissioner Lenarčič and others activated the civil protection mechanism, which is the way that EU countries have to ask each other for help. Italy, of course, the hardest hit country at the outset, asked for help, and the result was a terrifying silence. Everybody was in a worry that, in fact, they would need the protective gear that they had for their own citizens, where folks had just weeks earlier been ready to try to help China, suddenly were not willing to help each other. But what we then did see was, slowly but surely, the EU kick into its classic crisis management mode, which the EU now, the EU institutions, is quite good at. Brussels doing everything it could to unleash all the money that was left, and there wasn't much in the current year's budget and in the current long-term budget, which ends at the end of this year. In that sense, it was very unlucky because there was very little room that the Commission had, but it did everything it could, essentially tossing all the rules that normally constrain how governments use EU money out the window to say, we know this is a super emergency, go and do what you had to do. But then, remarkably, that same problem, that same challenge of being late in the budget presented an enormous opportunity, and that was the ability to link up the next long-term budget, the multi-annual financial framework, with the recovery plan. And that wouldn't have been possible if the crisis had occurred dead in the middle of a budget cycle. And so at that point, what you saw was a rather ingenious way, folks realizing, President von der Leyen and her team, Stephanie Rizzo and others, who saw that the EU budget, in interviews, it's very interesting to hear some civil servants talk about how much they admire the budget as if it was a living thing, because the EU budget is, in a way, this magical legal instrument that allows the entire bloc to coordinate. And so by using that vehicle that has existed and is in law to share resources and goals among the 27 EU countries, they were able to put together what is, in fact, a very historic 1.82 trillion euro rescue and recovery package. Now the question becomes still, will it be enough? And will it be fast enough? Because what we've also seen is even in July, much faster than many people predicted, the heads of state and government were able to come together and approve this. But the challenge they face is we're in a second wave. Again, there was a little bit of lax attitude after a nice summer toward the fact that the second wave was hitting, and a lot of catch up is being played now. We don't know that we've seen yet the full depth of the economic crisis here. And as Vice President just said, he's still in trilogue debates, negotiating when and how to actually unleash this money. So there, the EU is under some pressure to get the game on and really move fast, because that was a first wave response, and the second wave is now surging and crashing all across of Europe. But it is a historic achievement. To get this kind of joint debt is something that no one had ever seen before. Many countries, the frugals, as we call them, the Netherlands and Finland, there were others who were very reticent, very reluctant about this idea. But what this crisis exposed, and it is an important lesson for crisis response in general, is that the individual EU countries had a very, very different level of preparedness and ability to respond. So what the Netherlands could do, for example, or Germany, under the existing rules, they didn't even need the spending limits, the debt limits thrown at. Under the existing fiscal rules, they were able to unleash enormous firepower because they run balanced budgets. They've been very constrained and disciplined fiscally. In the South, of course, that was not anywhere near possible. And that also encouraged leaders to understand that in this case, where it was a crisis that was hitting everyone in the same way, that no one was exempt, that no country could be said to be to blame, that the EU really needed to come together. Because if countries like Germany and the Netherlands responded with what they could do for their own citizens, with their own budgets, and left other EU partners behind, that the bloc would really be at serious risk. And we've seen the EU manage that risk, come together, put together this historic package. Again, we will keep asking, is it enough? Is it fast enough? That's our job, certainly, as journalists. But I do think we have seen the EU prove yet again that it is quite resilient in a crisis. Some say that's exactly what it's there for.
Thank you, Mr. Herzenhorn.
You're welcome.
We're now moving to Berlin, to Dr. Puglerin. So, Mr. Herzenhorn painted in a relatively positive picture of how the EU has dealt with this pandemic, from an initial sort of focus on the member states thinking about, how can I deal with this, to gradually moving to a more institutionalized European response, and, as he says, going big. Now, I know that you and your colleagues at the ECFR have been closely following events in Brussels and are also undertaking some interesting research on these issues. What does the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic tell us about the state of the European Union in 2020?
Thank you very much for inviting me. At ECFR, you're right, I'm heading a project that is focused on looking at cohesion and cooperation in Europe. It's called Rethink Europe, and we particularly try to answer the question based on data. So what we did actually in the beginning of the first wave of the COVID crisis was to develop a tool to track Europe's responses to the crisis. Across several dimensions, we collected instances of pan-European solidarity. And we have developed an interactive tool, the so-called European Solidarity Tracker. And when you look at our data, I'm actually an optimist too, and I very much agree with David. So the picture is much less bleak than you would normally assume, and that kind of you would get when kind of listening to the first narratives. Because in early March there were two narratives. One was that kind of European member states would be pulling up the drawbridges again, and that there was a return to nationalism, and that China basically would come to our rescue with the mask diplomacy. And so while at the beginning, of course, there were national impulses that led to border closures and export restrictions on medical supplies, there is also another story to tell. And we can actually prove with our data that in the earliest days, pan-European solidarity was actually on display. And we looked at member states level. So what did member states for each other, but also on the EU level, but then also kind of on individual solidarity and on civil society. And so we have tracked kind of small instances of solidarity by individuals. For example, there was a 3D printing guru who early on developed kind of a blueprint for a face protection shield that he offered for free. Or, for example, there were kind of 15 language teachers that were sent from Portugal to Luxembourg to ensure the orderly opening of elementary schools. So we have little instances like this, and we have big instances. We have the hospitals that took in patients from other countries, but we also tracked, of course, the big activities like kind of when the member states and the EU institutions mobilized kind of 5 billion euros to help develop and ensure equitable access to coronavirus vaccines, tests, and treatments. So what we saw is actually a dense network of cooperation. We saw every member state doing something. We saw small member states contributing, big member states. We also saw that solidarity was not really regional. So we saw that a lot of countries from Central and Eastern Europe, be it through NATO mechanisms, be it through EU mechanisms, be it on a bilateral basis, have actually been helping Italy early on the medical front. So countries that on other issues like migration, or maybe the EU budget are on opposite ends, have been helping each other. And that was very encouraging. So up to the end of September, we were able to collect more than 1,200 items. And that is a very impressive picture. So in many ways, I think that the Europeans have proven that in face of crisis, they stand ready to lift each other up. And I think coupled with the recent institutional reforms, like the Common European Stockpile of medical supplies and the Recovery Fund with kind of unprecedented financial firepower, I think that leaves us now much better prepared as we now see the second wave of the pandemic. So I think that the two narratives that evolved early on in the crisis, that it was only about kind of the individual nation first, was not correct. And also the China issue actually was not correct. We also collected data on China, and it turned out that most of the so-called kind of donations actually were commercial purchases, and that basically the Chinese stopped by mid-May to provide these donations, and that kind of the masks were, when they were donated, sent to particular European countries also to ensure influence. So when we compared kind of the data on things that China delivered to European member states and what was done within the EU, that is completely not comparable. So the EU just did so much more, and that's why I remain very much optimistic. We do another data project that is called the ECFR European Cohesion Monitor, and we do this now in this 4th edition. It's coming out later this month, and we look at the state of cohesion, structural and individual cohesion in the European Union. And so before the crisis has hit us, the level of cohesion was actually pretty good and pretty strong. So besides all kind of the crises and the last decade, we started tracking data or cohesion in 2007 and are now able to look back 13 years. And what we see is that, of course, the Eurozone crisis and the migration crisis have affected the level of cohesion in the European Union, but we see a strong recovery. And actually both in terms of individual and structural cohesion, the EU was better off in 2019 than in all the previous years, and it actually reached kind of the crisis decade heights of 2007, when it comes especially to trust of EU citizens in the EU, when it comes to satisfaction with democracy, optimism in the EU's future. So I think, the crisis has hit us, but I think it hit us at a moment where we were actually quite strong. So that gives me hope. But there is a caveat to this. When you look at the cohesion in the member states, you see that some member states have been less prepared because they have kind of cohesion, be it structural, but especially individual cohesion has been less strong. And that is particularly the case in Southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Greece, but also to a certain level in France. So I think what we need to be aware of is that some countries were actually much less prepared to tackle this crisis, not only because of economic reasons, but also because there was less trust in the EU early on. There was less satisfaction with European democracy, and there was much less optimism. So I think we need to pay special attention to those countries in the south to prevent a further north-south divide. A last thing, and this is just something that I very much worry about because I'm a kind of foreign and security expert at heart. And what I think when we talk about resilience, I know this panel is about internal EU affairs, but I'm just worried that because we are so occupied with dealing with this crisis that we kind of tend to forget the world around us, and that we need to be aware that kind of resilience is not only about keeping the EU together and about solidarity, but it's also very much about sovereignty and about the EU's ability to act. And when I look at the recent EU performance in its neighborhood, be it Belarus, be it Nagorno-Karabakh, be it Libya, I'm less optimistic. And when I look at kind of the defense fund, the budget for the defense fund and kind of the successes of the PESCO projects, I'm also very worried. So I think we have to be aware that there will be less money for defense, for security, for foreign policy, and that we cannot actually afford to just concentrate on the internal, but we have also to look at the external dimension. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Puglerin. So at this point, first of all, I would urge everybody, if you have a question you would like to ask, we've already received questions, but if there are questions you would like to ask, I would urge you to write those in, and we will try to get to them in just a moment. But before we go to the Q&A part, we have a long-standing friend of the Riga conference standing by, Charles Powell, who will reflect on what we've discussed in the first half hour of this panel, and perhaps offer up a question or two to our panelists. So, Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Riga, and greetings from Madrid, Spain. By the way, I've just been in touch with Ana Palacio, and she sends you all her best wishes. Unfortunately, a member of her family is seriously ill, and she's been otherwise engaged this morning. But she sends you all her greetings and hopes to see you all soon. So since I'm actually the only representative of Southern Europe so far, I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid. Let me paint a slightly less rosy picture of Europe's response, and I'm a member of the Spanish chapter of the ECFR, so I endorse everything the ECFR representative has said, and of course her research is brilliant. Let me just remind you, first of all, we did not invoke Article 222 at the beginning of the crisis, which is the solidarity clause contained in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which was designed precisely for circumstances such as these. And I think we have to ask ourselves why this article was not invoked. Secondly, perhaps we should ask ourselves whether we shouldn't use the conference on the future of Europe, and this perhaps would be my question to the panel. Shouldn't we use the conference on the future of Europe to try to improve our response, both in formal institutional terms and also in terms of substance? If you actually reread Article 222, it's phrased in terms of assistance, a bit like NATO's Article 5, rather than in terms of guaranteeing cooperation between the member states and also between the member states and the EU itself. So I just want to put this on the table. You know, we had a legal instrument and we didn't use it. And of course, we had an institution. We already had a European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. Most Europeans have never heard of this institution, sadly. And I'm afraid that this institution's response was underwhelming. It failed to alert us to the dangers that were lurking on the horizon. And if it did alert people in private or confidentially, national governments certainly didn't take much notice. So I think we do have a fundamental problem here. Health is still essentially a national competence. But at the same time, our European citizens don't understand how that is possible because, of course, health, we are so now so closely interconnected economically and socially that obviously health should be a European competence at some level. Secondly, speaking from Spain, and I'm going to wear my Spanish hat here for a minute if I may, let me remind you that the impact in Spain and Italy has been absolutely brutal. Let us not forget, in the Spanish case, about 50, 60,000 people have died. In addition to that, the Spanish economy is going to shrink by at least 12% of GDP, and youth unemployment may reach extremely high figures, which take us back to the figures that we had in the financial crisis. 40% is one current prediction. So I think at our institute, at least, we are extremely concerned about the impact of this on inequality, and in particular on the future of youth. You know, they've suffered a double whammy. Youth unemployment hadn't really recovered from the previous financial crisis, and now another generation is going to be facing unprecedented challenges. So, as was just said a minute ago, there is certainly concern about inequality within states, but also inequality between states. Now, you were asking us, or you were asking the speakers rather, will the EU's response be enough, and will it reach member states fast enough? And I agree that the combination of the financial perspectives and the Next Generation EU package is extraordinary. It's unprecedented. It's something that we should all celebrate. But let me also remind you, there's a third issue, and not just the size and not just the speed. It's also the ability to use these funds properly. You know, countries like Spain and Italy have been using structural and cohesion funds very effectively over the last several generations, several decades. But the greening and the digitalization of an economy is a far greater challenge. It's not something you can do overnight. So I'm very concerned about, and this would be another question to you all, absorption capacity. In fact, you know, countries like Spain were no longer really absorbing the EU funds that were available to them as effectively as they had in the past. Spain has more kilometers of high-speed train tracks than any country in the world except China. That's fine, but you can't continue to build high-speed trains. You know, that is not the answer to our current problems. So absorption capacity is crucial here. And of course, this is largely a responsibility of member states, but above all, it's a responsibility of the societies concerned. And this takes me to another point, which is that resilience begins at home, ultimately. Resilience is a social phenomenon. There is enormous support for the EU in Spain, in fact, much more support for European institutions than for national institutions. And sadly, the crisis has hit Spain and Italy perhaps, but certainly Spain at a time of unprecedented political polarization and fragmentation. And the last point I'd like to make is strategic autonomy. We've been talking about this concept for a long time now. Until recently, we were basically talking about strategic autonomy in the context of foreign security and defense policy. I think the time has come now to give this concept a much broader meaning. And of course, this also affects Europe's role in the world. Strategic autonomy is not about doing things without the United States. It's about doing the things that we Europeans really want to do without asking others for permission, and most importantly, without having to ask others for assistance. Thank you very much.
Mr. Powell, you had a couple of questions there. Could you perhaps try to formulate them into a sort of brief question, and then we'll go around the panel with it?
My first question would be, how can we use the future conference on the future, the conference on the future of Europe, to try to prepare Europe and its member states for the next pandemic, really, because we know that this is lurking on the horizon. And perhaps more generally, how can we use the Conference on the Future of Europe not to debate endlessly about institutional or constitutional reforms, which are always controversial, but how can we think of new policy areas or think of ways in which the EU and the member states should work together more closely? And the second question perhaps is, we are basically talking about making virtue out of necessity, right? We're talking about modernizing our economies, using this unprecedented crisis to launch our economies firmly into the 21st century through this green and digital agenda. And my question here would be, how confident are we that member states will really be able to respond to the enormous administrative, practical, technocratic even challenges that involves? Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for those questions. And we're going to do a tour around in the same order as before, beginning with Madam President. How would you respond to Charles's questions about the ability for member states to absorb these extraordinary funds that will be available, but also the question of, how should we address the challenges of the pandemic in the Conference on the Future of Europe?
That's a very specific question, and I would hesitate to present on the spur of the moment an agenda for such a conference. But I can say a few words about the principles that should be included in the debate, and that would be the concept of how much national sovereignty is to be maintained in the historical understanding of the word that we have since the end of the Second World War, and to what extent we have to think of supranational organization and collaboration without becoming a federation of the type that you have in the United States or in Canada or even Germany as a federation. The integration that you find in a federation is of a different sort than the transnational collaboration that Europe is looking for. And one of the problems that I see in getting common action is getting a common understanding of what we mean by the basic concepts on which we operate. I have noticed during the last decade, in reaction to various crises, that there have been differences in reaction between different member states, which is perfectly natural. But there have also been complaints of insufficient understanding of the other, of insufficient solidarity with the other. But as a former psychologist, I would say that it takes two to tango, and when somebody is complaining of not being understood, my first question would be, have you also listened to and understood the other side? And maybe then, if we each take turns, as in a good debate, your turn to speak, my turn to speak, you question, I answer, vice versa. Many of the problems that have been ascribed to a lack of cohesion in the European Union are based on different conceptions of the conceptual content of the notions that hold us together. When we had an interruption of the supply chains of basic goods, for instance, because certain countries had closed their borders hoping to halt an invasion by the coronavirus. The unintended consequences of various actions of this sort are what causes misunderstanding, resentment, complications, and sometimes serious unforeseen and undesirable results. This is why I was talking earlier about the need of a crisis response center that would coordinate the crisis response centers in each national state. I think Switzerland has, for a long time now, had a very strong understanding of what civil defense means for them, and citizens have been prepared for various types of emergencies with advice and requirements as to what it is that each family should do for its own security and for its own ability to react in a crisis. I think that that sort of preparation is lacking. We cannot prepare for what we do not know is coming to hit us, but we can prepare to be prepared to respond to it. That is what I think we mostly need to have.
Thank you. Mr. Dombrovskis, how would you address these questions? And I suppose it's especially relevant, bearing in mind your position, is can member states absorb the funds going forward? And I think your microphone is turned off, Mr. Dombrovskis.
Yes, now it should be better, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start with maybe the first question on what lessons we are learning from this crisis and whether we address them through a conference on the future of Europe or through, well, classical institutional channels. I would say that's a secondary question here. But it's true that we'll have lessons to learn from this crisis and adjustments to do. And it was the same after global financial and economical crisis, because a number of things like European semester, where we coordinate fiscal and macroeconomic policies, European stability mechanism, banking union, all these were created as a response to global financial economical crisis, where EU was seeking what is a crisis response and how to make ourselves more resilient. And we see that actually all those instruments which were created then are working and helping now. So it's good that we have developed them. And similarly now, you mentioned, for example, ECDC, other institutions at EU level. EU currently has very limited competences in area of healthcare. But this pandemic has shown that if we are confronted with situations like this, we need to be able to act in a coordinated manner across EU. So there are lessons to be learned and also institutional structures to be strengthened to be able to respond better to this kind of crisis. Then moving to the second question, which is on absorption of funds. Well, first of all, I would say it's already a bit of a good problem to worry about, because before you can start worrying about absorption capacity, you need to make sure that there is lots of money available. So, and that's, I think, the good news, that there's lots of money available for member states. And you mentioned that Italy and Spain were the hardest hit by the crisis, but it's also true that Italy and Spain are by far the biggest recipients of funds from the European Economic Recovery Plan. So it also responds to this issue. Well, in terms of absorption capacity, so what we're expecting now, and we are in a sense working in parallel. Legislative process is still ongoing, but we are already working with member states concerning their recovery and resilience plans, where member states are designing those plans themselves, also setting themselves milestones by meeting which milestones they will be receiving funding from Recovery and Resilience Facility. And of course, there's also preparatory work ongoing for a classical cohesion policy. So so this is one thing how we try to respond to this, that we are running things in parallel, not to have further delays. Once legislative process will be concluded, we will able, so to say, immediately plug the member states' recovery resilience plans into it and get going. And second, well, green and digital transition in any case will require massive investment. and member states have their emission reduction targets. Once again, to meet those emission reduction targets, massive investment will be needed, and it will be needed across different areas. Mentioned some initiatives, for example, what we call renovation wave, so improving energy efficiency of buildings, which is one of the biggest emitters, and member states can develop plans in this regards. Well, smart grids, renewable energies, development of electromobility and necessary infrastructure for electromobility. This is just to give you some examples how member states can use the funding available. And similarly, there are a number of projects on digital rollout of 5G, to give just one example. So we are working with member states. There are very substantial investment needs which need to be met to ensure that economy is actually transformed, and that this transformation is accompanied also by necessary support measures, including reskilling measures, social measures, to ensure that this transformation is not leaving people and regions behind. So, so from that point of view, I would say we have major challenges to face. Money is there, and we are working with member states to ensure that this money will be successfully and productively used. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Herzenhorn, so can you tell us, in the space of 1 minute, what issues should be on the agenda on the Conference for the Future of Europe?
Well, whether it's on the agenda of the Conference of the Future of Europe or on the minds of EU officials in general, I want to focus on Charles's point about Article 222 and the solidarity clause, and also other mutual defense components of the European Union. There's a lot of hesitation, a lot of reticence you hear among member states, and including from Commission officials, to reach to that next step of admitting that, in fact, there's an obligation in the treaties to come to each other's defense, especially when we talk about it in a military context. And to that end, there is a real challenge. Right now, there's a debate that's begun, a proposal from the Commission for a European health union, because, as Vice President Dombrovskis said, the legal authority for health policy remains largely in the capitals. The EU institutions don't have that power and authority yet. And on the one, we know with cross-border health threats, there's a crucial need for that more centralized, more federalized authority. And at the same time, one of the things we've learned in this pandemic from all the public health experts is that for a public health response to work, citizens must have high confidence in their dealing with officials they know, and that can be accomplished often better on a local, regional, national basis. And so the question that has to be asked, as always for the EU, is where are the capitals that they're willing to give up some power? Where are they willing to let Brussels take over if necessary? But at the same time, there's a practical question about, can Brussels respond in a local way? Folks have been joking throughout this recent American presidential election that some Europeans seem to know the American electoral college system better than they know the EU institutions. So there has to be an effort made, I would say, to familiarize Europeans, to have them expect a European response. And there, finishing up quickly, I'd say one question is, should the EU have quickly named some sort of pandemic response czar, somebody who would be out in front of the cameras day after day, sort of driving home a message from the European level, using the data from the ECDC, but providing that kind of familiarity where European citizens start to expect to see European level officials on their televisions, in their living rooms, night after night, responding to what's going on in their lives, or are they still relying only on their national capitals?
Thank you. And the same question to you, Dr. Puglarin. What should be on the agenda for the conference on the future of Europe? And do you have anything to add about absorption?
Actually, I'm not an expert on the conference of the future of Europe, and I would like to prefer to add something to what David just said on Article 222 and also Article 427, because I completely share his concerns. But I think there is, when it comes to defense and the articles, there is an opportunity right now when it comes to the strategic compass exercise in the European Union, because there is going to be a resilience basket within the strategic compass. And so I think that kind of this is very much to debate right now what do these articles actually mean. I think a problem with Article 222 is that kind of it states that, or kind of the kind of to invoke the solidarity clause, it says that the country, the EU country affected may invoke the solidarity clause if it considers that its own response capacities are overwhelmed. And I think that is actually a problem with the clause so far. That has been a problem with the clause in 2015, because it's actually very difficult for a member state to say that its own response capabilities are overwhelmed, because that could also be interpreted as an interpretation or declaration of bankruptcy from the state. So I think this is just one of the reasons why it's difficult to activate this clause. And one last word about the question of strategic autonomy and to extend it. I totally agree. I wouldn't call it strategic autonomy, because I think the term is too loaded and divisive. But I mean, I was very surprised to hear our own German defense minister talking, and our chancellor actually talking about European health sovereignty. This was actually part of the compromise between Germany and France. And I think when it comes to Germany, this crisis has moved a lot when it comes to health. Germany has been very much opposed any Europeanization of health policy. For a very long time, it has been one of the staunchest opponents in the European Union. And now, already before the crisis, but now through the crisis, I think it really got Germany to change its mind. So here is to hope again. I think this is my role on this panel today. But I think that actually there are already good plans to work on European health sovereignty, and a growing awareness that kind of we need more a European database for this, and more cooperation in research and development, and also when it comes to bringing supply chains back and to making Europe more resilient, and making kind of medical equipment and vaccines and available in Europe, produce and to produce the ingredients and all this kind of in Europe, or not only in China. So I think that we have seen progress here.
Thank you so much. Now, our time technically is up, but I will steal a couple of minutes from the organizers, and I'm sure that the organizers are very nice, so I'm sure they will let me do that, to give everybody the opportunity to have some closing words. And I would ask you to try to sort of stick to about 30 to 40 seconds. Now, we've had a couple of questions, and I think you can choose to answer whichever one of the questions you think is the most relevant. There was one addressed specifically to Madame President, which asks about divided societies, and that the US elections has pointed this out. And we know that we have similarly divided societies, perhaps not quite to the 50-50 extent in the US, but we also have a certain polarization of societies in Europe. How should we try to handle that going forward? That's one question which you can address. Another one which has been put forward specifically to Mr. Dombrovskis, but also I would invite anybody else to also answer it if they want, which is, you know, are there challenges that we can fix without money? So is it always money that's needed to fix European challenges, or are there some challenges we can fix without these sort of enormous European funds? And then the last question here is about Brexit. We haven't talked about it really. It's been in the background all the time, but is Brexit of any relevance to European resilience going forward? And this time I think we'll go in the reverse order that we had before. So we'll start with Dr. Puglerin, then continue with Mr. Herzenhorn, then Mr. Dombrovskis, and then give the final word to Dr. Weidewiege-Freiberger. So Dr. Puglerin.
So my final words are just, again, a plea for kind of to be aware how difficult the situation is, especially for Southern Europe. We can see it in our cohesion data that there was a certain vulnerability before. The countries are hit particularly hard, and I think especially in the next year, we will have to be very aware that there is a special challenge, and that that these countries actually need special attention because it's not in our interest to deepen the North-South divide in Europe even further. So this is just my plea.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buglarin. Actually, the organizers tell me I've stolen a little bit too much time already. So unfortunately, we won't be able to have the final words from everybody else. I just have to thank you all for participating in the panel. There's been so much to go through. I mean, these are such big issues, and I think we've handled quite a lot of it magnificently. I apologize to those of you who haven't had the opportunity to say some final words, but we have to get on with the schedule here. So thank you very much for joining us, and then hang on for the next sessions of the Riga conference.